Okay, so thank you a lot for that very kind introduction, and thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm very excited to be able to be here and to present some of my recent work. Um, what I will present today is a theory paper joined with my colleague Kjell Arnbrekke. And the main argument we are developing in this paper is the idea that if you rely too much on people's moral motivation to contribute voluntarily to public goods, then this can actually undermine the very moral motivation that made people willing to contribute voluntarily in the first place. So let me get to the paper itself. Oh, things don't work as I expect. Okay, now you can see the second slide, I hope. Yes. So so let me first give you a very, very brief overview of what the paper is about. It started out with a paper that I published together with colleagues more than 20 years ago now, which is a paper about moral motivation as a motive to contribute voluntarily to public goods. And I was curious what would happen in a model like that if you allowed there to be some kind of conflicting interest and also social interaction. Because in this previous paper, there's a lot of harmony. People had this moral motivation, but everybody's identical, so there is no really conflict of interest. You have the standard prisoner's dilemma game, of course, or free rider problem. But apart from that, there are no conflicts. Everybody has the same preferences, the same ethical views, the same income. And also in that paper, there is no really real social interaction. So you care about a sort of internalized personal norm, but you don't really care about what other people think about you. So I was curious what would happen if we allow social interaction and conflicts of interest into a model such like this, like this one. So what we do here is we take as our starting point and point the old model. There are some differences in the details, but the main setup is fairly similar to the old model. And then we allow incomes to differ. We also allow people to have different ethical views. So in the beginning, people's ethical views are exogenously given, but then over time, there may be social learning, and which may over time change people's ethical views. So there will be social learning, and there will also be social migration. So in the model, there are going to be different peer groups. So you're going to be part of one social peer group. And in the short run, these groups are going to be fixed. But over time, then every now and then people will be will reconsider, maybe I should change my peer group. So there will be some social interaction here as well. What we will find is that in the long run, in a model such like this one, then when you base when the public good provision is only through voluntary private contributions, then over the long run, what will develop is firstly segregation according to income. So over time, the rich people will flock together in one group, the poor people will flock together in a different group. And there will be normative polarization in the sense that over time, the poor people become more and more egalitarian, while the rich people become more and more anti-egalitarian, or we call it libertarian. Moreover, in this steady state, there will be voluntary contributions to the public good, but they will be minimal in the sense that I will explain more in detail later. So why is it that we find this, especially this minimal contributions result? And the main intuitive reason why we get a sort of dismal equilibrium like this is that at least in our model, moral obligations is going to be a burden. So if you feel a heavier moral obligation, then it's a burden because either you have to actually contribute, which is costly, or you will get a bad conscience. So the more you think you should contribute, the heavier is your burden. And these social interaction that arise, they will implicitly, not directly, but implicitly, they're going to help people ease their burdens. Now, one interesting part here, in my view at least, is that if instead of relying on voluntary contributions, you have a government that provide the public good and fund this through taxes, then we still get the segregation according to income, and we still get disagreement, but the disagreement can possibly very modest. So in the tax-funded government provision case, we don't necessarily get this kind of strong polarization. And the intuitive reason for that is really that, well, your ethical views determine how heavy your moral burden to contribute voluntarily is. It doesn't determine your tax burden because your tax burden is not voluntary. So if you change your moral view to become a little bit less implicitly self-serving, then in the voluntary contribution case, it is going to imply that you should contribute more. But in the tax financed case, it is not going to increase your tax burden. So in the tax funded government provision case, the link between your ethical views and what you actually have to contribute is so much weaker, and that is why we don't see the same polarization in that case. Okay, so that's a quick version of the story. Let me emphasize right away that the kind of polarization we get here is not the kind of polarization that you see in the US right now, for example, which is, more between of authoritarian or anti-authoritarian forces, or maybe identity-driven cultural differences and things like that. So we have developed a companion paper with a much more general model, which can possibly explain phenomena like that. But that model is less specific. It is not about contributions to public goods, and it is not necessarily about pro-sociality as such. So what I will present here is the more specific model about where your self-image and your social image depends on how much you contribute to public goods. So the polarization is old-fashioned in the sense that although it cannot help explain what we see in the US right now, it can help explain more, you might say, class-oriented disagreements that we have been seeing for many, many years, perhaps less right now, such that people's income being strongly correlated with fairness views that are implicitly self-serving. That is something we still that people have observed for a long time, and which is still observed. Also, the fact that social interaction seem to be mainly within one's own socio-economic group. And also the finding that in many experiments, people find that if the group playing against each other is heterogeneous in economically relevant ways, then it is much harder to keep up voluntary cooperation, and it seems to be related to normative conflict, that the different people support different fairness principles. Okay, so with that, I think I'll jump directly into the model, unless there are clarification questions at this point. Okay. So the model has a static short-run part and a dynamic long-run part. The only thing you decide in the short-run part, in the static part, is how much to contribute to the public good. In that part, your ethical views are going to be fixed. You're going to consider your ethical views as, a conviction that you cannot just choose to keep or to discard. And also in the short run, you're going to consider your social peer group and other groups as fixed. But in the long run, there will be social learning of ethical views, and there will be some migration between peer groups. So let's begin with the static part. I don't know if everybody is an economist here. I'm going to, in the way economists usually do, I'm going to present a lot of equations. I'm not going to do any advanced calculations with it. I'm just going to show you the premises of the model and the results. I will aim to explain everything I do intuitively, verbally. But if I forget to do so, just stop me and ask. But I need to present the equations, otherwise the economists always get so confused. So, first, everybody has an income which is determined outside the model and which will be fixed throughout. For any given person, the income will be fixed throughout the whole period we are looking at. So your income is Y, and you can spend your income either on private consumption or on contributions to the public good. You could think of that as environmental quality, maybe. And the total environmental quality is determined by the sum of everybody's contributions. So far, there is no public sector here. And now let us turn to people's preferences. The preference structure, as such, is going to be identical for everybody. And we assume that people have preferences that they care about four things. Their private consumption, which we assume is on the log form, meaning that if you have another unit of consumption is going to count less for you the more consumption you already have. Apart from that, everything is entered in a linear fashion here. Preferences for a public good, for your self-image, and for your social image. How do you get a good self-image? This is very similar to the old paper. A good self-image is something you get by first considering what do you think from a moral perspective, what I should ideally do. What is the morally ideal thing for me to do? Or in this case, what is a morally ideal public good contribution for me? That is what I call EII star, the ideal thing for me to do as judged by myself. That is why there is two I's. The first is the ideal contribution for me, and the second is as judged by me. So the closer I get with my actual contribution to what I think I ideally should do, the better is my self-image. So you can regard this as cognitive dissonance, the further I am away from what I think I should do, the worse is my self-image, or the higher is cognitive dissonance. If I contribute too much, more than I think I should, I don't get any additional or reduced self-image from that. And similarly with the social image, then in the same way, my social image is better the closer I am to my actual contribution is to the ideal contribution. But now the ideal contribution is not what I think I should ideally do, but what my peer group on average think that I should do. So in this model, I will show you on the next slide how we arrive at these morally ideal contributions. And there's going to be we are actually assume that everybody is able to judge what everybody else and themselves should ideally contribute. And the average of the view of everybody in your peer group of what you should contribute is this thing I call EIG star. The view of your peer group of what you should do. So this is a little bit like what psychologists would call an injunctive norm, this ideal here. The closer you get to your group's view of what you should do, the better is your social image. Okay, what are these E-star things, the right thing to do? And what we assume here is simply that the right thing to do is the thing to do that would maximize social welfare. This was a bit more complicated in the old paper, but here we can do it very simply because almost everything is linear. So you don't have to think about what everybody else is doing. So we will be assuming that everybody is a utilitarian, but they can be a weighted utilitarian, and what weights they use can differ between individuals. We are also going to assume that when people judge social welfare, how good is this society? They don't take into account image concerns. They only consider how much consumption does everybody have and how much access to the public good does everybody have. So there are many philosophical and economic reasons why image concerns should be included in the social welfare function. There are also a lot of arguments why it should not be included in the social welfare function. Here, it makes the analysis much simpler to not include it. So that's what we are doing. So we are assuming that every single individual had their own view of what makes a good society. They have their social welfare function, which is subjective. It is their view of social welfare. And it is weighted utilitarian, so it is the sum of everybody's what you could think of as material well-being. It's people's consumption utility and people's environmental benefits. But every individual's benefit is weighted by this parameter mu, which can vary between the judging individuals and between each judged individual. So this can vary between people. So if I'm an classical utilitarian, I think everybody's utility should have the same weight. Then this weight will be the same for everyone. It will actually be 1 over n because these weights are relative. But if I am a libertarian in the sense that I think the income that I have, I should be allowed to keep, then implicitly I will give a higher weight to rich people than to poor people. Okay, and my view of the morally ideal contribution for you is that contribution from you that would maximize social welfare, in my view. Okay. And this may differ between individuals because, well, actually, I think I switched the order of the letters here, but never mind. My view of your ideal contribution is that contribution from you that would maximize my view of social welfare. Now, these mu parameters here are really cumbersome to work with because they are so many. For my view of everybody else's welfare, there are n parameters, and then since we are n people making judgments, there are too many parameters to work with. And in this model, as long as you require reasonably anonymous and continuous welfare judgments, then the only thing that really differs between people here is people's income, and thus the private consumption they are able to buy from their income. So what we do is to make a measure of that we call Q, which is a person's degree of egalitarianism versus libertarianism. So if my QI is equal to 1, it means that I am fully egalitarian. I think everybody should have the same welfare weight. If my Q is 1, I'm a perfect libertarian, and then it means that I actually use what we often call negation weights. I place more emphasis on the utility of richer people, which you could argue could be because I believe, for example, that their higher income is deserved because they worked hard for it, for example. So in practice, I'm not going to work with these mu's. I'm going to work with the Q. So which measure your position on the scale from egalitarianism on the left to libertarianism on the right. Okay. Okay. I'm going to talk about rich and poor people. And rich is going to simply mean somebody who earns more than the average. And poor simply means that you earn less than the average. If I'm an egalitarian, so my Q is equal to 0, then I think that if you are rich, you should contribute a lot. Well, if you are poor, you do not have to contribute so much. If I'm a libertarian, so I'm on the right-hand side of the scale here, then I think if you are rich, you should contribute some, but not so much, because the poor should also contribute their share. So the libertarian places higher moral burdens on the poor and lower moral burdens on the rich than the egalitarians do. Which means that for the rich, this moral burden that somebody is placing on them, I think I switched the small letters here again. So what I'm trying to say is that if you are rich, then the more libertarian I am, the less I'm going to demand from you. But if you are poor, then the more libertarian I am, the more I am going to require from you in moral terms. Okay.
Karine,
Yes.
there was one question from Marco. Maybe you ask it directly, but I tried here. I'm not sure if it's already solved, but does I assume that EJ is chosen by all other individuals? So does she universalize EJ to all others? I'm sure, Marco, maybe you want to add.
Let me see. Does exactly. I think so. So, tell me if I'm if I misunderstand your question. But I think what you are so in the old paper, what we had to the way we define the morally ideal contribution in the old paper was to say, given that everybody else acts just like myself, what would be the socially best thing for me to do? Here we are simply asking, what is the socially best thing for me to do? And the reason is that since everything is more or less linear here, the social impact of what I do doesn't depend on what everybody else is doing. So we simply don't have to take that into account. Was that an answer to your question? Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's proceed. Okay, so given the assumptions that we have made, it will actually be the case here that everybody will agree on the socially optimal level of the public goods supply. So everybody thinks that the public goods supply should equal a particular level E star. I'm not giving you the expression for it; it's in the paper, but everybody agrees on this. So implicitly due to the setup of the model. So what they disagree on is not how much environmental goods we should have or its quality, but what they disagree about is what is the most fair burden sharing. I think there was another question here. So let me see. Does the model allow for a view on egalitarianism where everyone should contribute the same, regardless of whether they are poor or rich? Right. So in our model, the egalitarian, um, hmm, everybody contributes exactly the same. So if everybody actually, if in this
It is the
model,
one, or?
yeah, so in this model, egalitarianism means that everybody consumes exactly the same. And to make everybody consume the same, they have to contribute differently because incomes are different. And that's actually the reason why in this model, classical utilitarianism is the same thing as egalitarianism, because a classical utilitarian would, unweighted utilitarianism, would think that everybody should have the same level of consumption. So even if you have more inequality averse social welfare functions, it wouldn't give even more equalizing of consumption than that. Now, if you wanted a version where everybody pays the same, that would not correspond to libertarianism in the model, because actually when you look at the expressions in the model, libertarianism would imply that everybody contributes exactly the same share of their income. So the essence of that is that you don't use contributions as a mean of redistributing income. But if everybody were to pay the same nominal amount, then I think, I haven't thought carefully through this. I think what sort of ethical principle you would need to get that result depends on the initial income distribution. Because if everybody has the same income, then everybody giving the same contribution will be the same thing as egalitarianism. But when incomes are different, this would depend on how incomes differ, I think. And we also make some assumptions, making sure that nobody's contributions will become negative. But I haven't thought carefully through this, so I don't think I should go further into that discussion. But thanks for the question. Okay. Right. So far about the static part of the model. Now let's turn to the dynamics. And the dynamics have two parts. It's social learning and it's social migration. So let's start with the social learning and imagine, just for the time being, that there is no social migration, just to make things simpler. We are assuming that during each period, you meet some random person from your own peer group. And then you look at that person and you consider what is the ethical position of that other person. And what you think is the ethical position of the other person is what I have called Q tilde here. You cannot know for sure what people think, what their position is, but you can make a judgment, depending on what they say, how they behave, and so on. But this judgment is biased, but there is some uncertainty. And then you move a little bit towards that person's other, that what you think that person believes. So, of course, there is no such thing as an objectively correct ethical view. So where do these ethical views come from? It seems reasonable to think that they somehow is something we have learned from others. So when you meet somebody else, you move a little bit in what you think is the direction of that person. But then we introduce what we call reluctance, which means that if you think moving in the direction of the other person would reduce your self-image, it would imply greater moral demands on yourself, and thus a worse self-image, or either bigger contributions or a worse conscience, then you're going to move a little bit less in that direction. So this is what it looks like. You don't need to see the details of that if you're not interested. But the meaning of this is that the rich are going to be a little bit reluctant to adopt more egalitarian views than their previous position, while the poor are going to be reluctant to adopt more libertarian views than they already have, because that would pose a heavier moral burden on them. Why do we need this uncertainty and the reluctance? Now, if you imagine that there is social learning, but the learning is unbiased, there is no reluctance, and there is no social migration, then over time, since everybody is mimicking the others a little bit, then everybody would move closer and closer towards the group average. And that is everything that would happen. But it is the combination of uncertainty and reluctance that causes the polarization. Because every time you judge what somebody else thinks, the person you randomly meet, you may make some mistake. And if learning was unbiased, the mistakes would cancel out over time. But since you are reluctant, you are implicitly going to place more emphasis on those mistakes that are implicitly in your favor than those mistakes which makes your burden heavier. So it is the combination of uncertainty and reluctance that move the group in towards one extreme or the other. Which extreme the group is moved to depends, as long as there is no migration, it depends on whether the majority in the group is rich or poor. But let us move to migration and see what happens then. So we assume that every now and then people ask themselves, okay, I am in a group now, but maybe people would like me better in the other group. So technically what we do here is we assume that there are only two groups and there are equally many rich and poor, which is an extreme simplification. And then we derive this result, the equilibrium using that. And then afterwards, we show that the result also holds if you have many groups or if the groups have endogenous size. So this simplification of only two groups is not essential. But every now and then you ask, would they like me better in the other group? Right. And here is where the social image comes in. So the poor people, of course, they prefer egalitarian pairs because given what you already do, the egalitarian people are going to like your contribution better. But the rich ones, they will prefer libertarian pairs. So, and this leads us to the steady state where all the rich flock together in one group and they hold a completely libertarian view. All the poor flock together in the other social group and hold a completely egalitarian view. And this is an absolute contribution minimum in the sense that no other combination of ethical views and sorting into groups would yield strictly lower contributions to the public good. And everybody thinks that, the rich thinks that the poor contribute way too little. The poor thinks that the rich contribute way too little, but they think their own behavior is quite okay. I think I skip this slide because I'm thinking I'm getting short of time and I'm skipping this one too. Let's turn to government provision. Okay. What happens if instead there's a government that uses taxes to fund the public good provision? So let's assume now that we still have the same different incomes, but now you have to spend some of your income on taxes, and then this epsilon thing corresponds to the previous E, that is what you contribute voluntarily over and above your taxes. So the taxes are going to be used exclusively to provide the public good. So your total contribution to the public good will now be the taxes you pay plus any voluntary contribution. Okay. Let's assume now that the policy process is such that government policy is going to take place according to some normative view QM. And I'm not going to go into the process of why it is exactly QM or what QM should be, but assume that QM is the view corresponding to the policy, the actual policy. And remember now that everybody agrees about the optimal public good supply, meaning that since policy is according to view QM, the policy will also imply a public good provision, which everybody will agree is according to the first best. But people disagree about what is the fair burden sharing. So the actual burden sharing through taxes will correspond to this view QM, and not everybody will agree to that. Now, if you are rich and you are more libertarian than the policymaker, then you will think that you pay too high taxes than what is fair. If you are poor and you are more egalitarian than the policymaker, you will also think that you pay too high taxes, okay? And this leads us to the result that as long as we have this these inequalities here, that the rich people hold a view which is more libertarian than the policymaker. The poor people hold a view which is more egalitarian than the policymaker. Then any state which is such that all the rich are in one group and all the poor are in the other. So we do have this income segregation, and everybody agrees on these group views. Then this will be a stable state. So if we start with a situation where the rich and the poor have fairly similar views, then once this inequality holds, the polarization will simply stop, even if the disagreement is very small. Because in this case, everybody find that their own taxes are too high. So they don't feel obliged to contribute anything voluntarily at all. There will be no migration, because if you move to the other group, everybody there would think you should pay more than you do, but in your own group, people think you pay too much. And there would be no reluctance, because any change in ethical view would still make you think that you pay too much, because these inequalities are strict. So polarization will stop very soon, but this requires that the political process is such that QM is between the views of the rich and the poor. So the policy process is a compromise sort of process. Alternatively, you could go a little bit outside of the model and say that, okay, as long as the public good supply is high enough already, I don't feel a moral contribution, a moral obligation to contribute, then actually we wouldn't even get segregation. But that is a little bit outside of the model, because in this model, if you think you pay too little taxes, then you will feel obliged to contribute to the public good, even if the supply is already high, because your own contribution is less socially useful. But let's skip that. So, to sum up, morally motivated people will contribute voluntarily to public goods. But if you add these social mechanisms and the different incomes, then these social mechanisms work to ease people's burdens in the long run, and that also reduce their contributions. So as a result, or sort of by effect of this, you get polarization and segregation, and unfortunately also minimal contributions, because the very moral motivation is being undermined. If you have government provision funded by taxes, you keeping strictly to the model, you still get the segregation, but not necessarily any extreme polarization. Extreme polarization would occur if it was there initially, but it would not arise due to these social processes. And I think that's it.